Scrambled paragraphs. Paragraph 1. Chinese sailors used magnetic compasses long before Europeans did. What would the best follow-on sentence to this main topic sentence be? Would it be Q, then hanging in a windless place? Well, then usually suggests it comes after immediately following some other statement, and that would not be the main topic sentence in all likelihood. So I'll eliminate Q as our first follow-on sentence. How about S? This balancing act was hard to maintain. Well, what is this balancing act? That's not mentioned in the first sentence, so I'll eliminate S as a follow-on. U, a more effective way to keep the needle free to move in response to its magnetic pull was to attach a strand. Well, that sounds like a detailed description of some type of compass or magnetic compass. That does not look like a follow-on to the first sentence. How about R? The magician would magnetize a needle and balance it on the rim of a cup to act as a compass. That possibly could be. Let's check T, the last option. In fact, some of the earliest compasses in recorded history were made by magicians in ancient China. Well, I think that's actually better because it does introduce magicians, which suggests the last sentence we looked at, R, follows this. But this fits nicely as our first follow-on sentence. Chinese sailors used magnetic compasses long before Europeans did. In fact, which is a good transition, some of the earliest compasses in recorded history were made by magicians in ancient China, which only supports or proves the fact that Chinese used compasses before Europeans did, which is the main topic sentence. So T is a nice follow-on to that. What would follow T? Well, with Q, S, U, and R we went through, we noticed R began with the magician. So that is probably providing some detail of exactly how the magicians created or used their first compasses. And let's read it and see if that makes sense. R. The magician would magnetize a needle and balance it on the rim of a cup to act as a compass. Well, that's exactly how they would make the first needle. So the connection between magician at the end of T and the beginning of R suggests they're linked, and R actually explains how the earliest compasses were created by the magicians. Let's find the follow-on to that, which would probably provide more detail about that compass. Would it be Q, then hanging in a windless place, the magnetized end of the needle would always point to the south? Or S, this balancing act was hard to maintain and the needle often fell? Or U, a more effective way to keep the needle free to move in response to its magnetic pull was to attach a strand of silk to the center of the needle with a tiny piece of wax. Well, I think S, this balancing act, because R introduces the compass is made up of essentially a needle balancing on the rim of a cup. So this balancing act, this pronoun, is referring to the balancing of the needle on the rim of a cup to act as a compass, which would, I assume, would allow it to spin around. However, as it spun around, the needle often fell off, as tells us. That's a problem. And between our final two choices, we've narrowed it down to a 50-50 situation at this point, and we must choose between U and Q to follow S. It looks like U is the better follow-on because U actually speaks to the difficulty of the needle falling off the rim of the cup. It says, in fact, a more effective way than balancing on the rim of a cup where it often falls off is what's suggested by that. A more effective way to keep the needle free to move in response to its magnetic pull was to attach a strand of silk to the center of the needle. Then, immediately following attaching the needle to a strand of silk, hanging in a windless place, the magnetized end of the needle would always point to the south, and presumably would do so without falling off anything because it's now hanging from a thread. So I like the order of our paragraph 1. We have Chinese developing compasses before Europeans and some details about how they did that. They were first made by magicians who would balance the needle on a rim of a cup, but they often fell off, so that wasn't a very good method. And then they developed a more effective way by tying it to a needle and letting it hang, and then the needle would point to the south. So let's go with that order, and we'll move on to paragraph 2. Paragraph 2. In the West, we are most familiar with world explorers who were of European origin. What would follow that? Well, I'm going to immediately suggest that the main topic sentence is looking for some kind of story about world explorers who are not of European origin or not from the West. But let's take a look and see what we find. We'll begin with R. Perhaps the most far-flung of these lesser-known travelers was Ibn Battuta, a North African who left his birthplace of Tangier. Okay, nobody suggested lesser-known travelers at this point from the main topic sentence. I did, but that's not a good immediate follow-on, so we'll eliminate R. T. Some lesser-known explorers, however, logged enough miles and adventures to make Marco Polo's journey look like an evening stroll. Well, that could fit. So temporarily, I'm going to put T right up there behind the first sentence. But let's check U, S, and Q as well. Battuta's journey lasted 24 years. Well, that's again talking about Battuta, who is not introduced in the first sentence. So U is not correct. S. Ibn Battuta traveled all over Africa and Asia. Again, that's introducing him, but that's not really perhaps the best follow-on to the topic sentence. Q. Marco Polo, a European who traveled to China in the 13th century, serves as a classic example. That is actually even better than T for the first follow-on sentence, because Marco Polo is an example of an explorer of European origin, which we know very well in the West. So it now reads, in the West, we are most familiar with world explorers who are of European origin. Marco Polo, a European who traveled to China in the 13th century, serves as a classic example. Now I think we can look to T as the follow-on to that. Some lesser-known explorers, however being the contrasting transition word between Marco Polo, a Western explorer, and perhaps an Eastern explorer, which is probably the Battuta mentioned in the other sentences, however, logged enough miles and adventures to make Marco Polo's journey look like an evening stroll. So we have Q, T in place, and now we've got to decide the next follow-on sentence between R, U, and S. We have two that are talking specifically about Battuta's journey in Ibn Battuta, U and S, but we have not introduced Ibn Battuta yet, so I don't think those are correct. It's probably correct that R follows T. And in fact, it looks like a very good follow-on. Perhaps the most far-flung of these lesser-known travelers was Ibn Battuta, a North African who left his birthplace of Tangier in the year 1325. So Battuta is introduced in R as an example of a lesser-known explorer who logged more miles than Marco Polo. U and S. Battuta's journeying lasted 24 years and covered at least 75,000 miles. Or is the best fit to follow RS. Ibn Battuta traveled all over Africa and Asia, including China, Indonesia, the Maldive Islands, and the coast of East Africa. I would suggest S is a better follow-on. And again, now we're down to that 50-50. Battuta was introduced in R, and S indicates or outlines what Battuta did. He traveled all over Africa, Asia, and China, Indonesia, etc. U would then be the only choice for the final sentence, and it fits quite nicely because U says Battuta's journeying, referring again to Battuta in sentence S, lasted 24 years, covered 75,000 miles, most of it by land, a record that would not be surpassed for 500 years. Well, those are more details about Battuta's travel in S through Africa, Asia, China, and Indonesia. We're actually giving some specific logged examples of times and mileage spent traveling. So I think that's a good follow-on, and it wraps up quite nicely because it mentions that that's a record that would not be surpassed for another 500 years, which is a nice concluding point to the paragraph. So I like our ordering of paragraph 2. Let's move on to the next.